Back to our fifth video on MOO Programming. We're talking about properties right now. In the last video, we showed how a parent's property could be defined, and then its child will define the same property until it is overwritten. And the important thing there is that when a child's property is overwritten, that property is now taking up twice, well, not necessarily twice the space, but the space equal to both properties. So on our number 2 object, right, we have the newt victim message. Previously, it was what's called clear, right? So there's an isClear property method, right? And it takes an object and a property name. This is a built-in function. If a property is clear, then it is only inheriting from its parent. If it is not clear, then it is overwriting whatever the value that its parent stored. So if you want to clear a property, it's not enough to just set a property to an empty string. You're still taking up more space in your database by storing an empty string on a unclear property than you are clearing that property out. So if you clear property, which is another built-in function, you pass it an object, and you tell it the property name, newt victim message. That property is clear now, meaning it is, if I check it, BBBB, which is what my parent defines for the value of that property. And if I run isClearProperty, I will see that it is in fact clear. So it's very important when you are dealing with properties to make sure that properties that should be clear are clear, and to understand that if you are overwriting a parent's property on a child, you're taking up more space in your database to store that. Instead of pointing to the parent's property, it's pointing to its own property, even if the value is the same. So if I have ASDF defined for newt victim message on my parent, and then I @set myself to have that same newt victim message of ASDF, I'm, even though they're the same, taking up twice the amount of space. So we're going to create a property on ourselves. Now that we know all this about properties, we're going to create a prop on ourselves called debug. Well, not debug. We'll say, and it's not going to be on ourselves. So @parentsme, we'll say on generic programmer, right? Let's check the properties that they currently have. Eval subs, eval ticks, eval env, and prog options, right? So we could, if we wanted to, add a new value to say prog options, right? We're not going to do that. We'll just add a new property in general, @prop number 58.debugging enabled, and we will set it to 0. So now, in our code, what this code does, just to refresh, these are comments. They are basically ignored during execution. We then check to see if debugging is enabled on the debugger itself, global debugging, right? If it's not, we return immediately, right? If it is enabled, we will do a literal, or this is our variable name, and we will assign it to the value of this. So we're saying the string debug info, and then just kind of pointing to the toLiteral of whatever arguments were passed into this verb by whatever verb is calling it, plus another string called callers, and then we're doing a toLiteral on the return value of callers, which is basically the objects and verbs that called the verb that we're currently in. We're then looping over all the descendants of number 58. Now just to remind you what this looks like, the descendants of number 58 are these objects. You'll notice I'm in here, then 71, 36, and 57. 57 being the generic wizard. If you want to quickly take an array or a list of objects and see the names associated with them, you can use stringutils NN, which is an abbreviation for name and number. And we can pass in the object utils call, which will return. So what's going to happen here is that this executes its code and returns a list, which is then passed to stringutils name and number, which then prints out generic wizard, hacker, housekeeper, and wizard. I'm wizard. And it took 160 ticks to execute that. So inside here, debugger is going to be set first to number 57, then to number 36, then to number 71, and then to number 2. Just to illustrate this, we will do a player tell debugger, just so you can see what's actually happening. So we'll call debugger critical ASDF, and you can see first we printed out 57, then 36, then 71, then 2. 2 is us, so it also executed this line for us, and we actually saw the debugging info. So what we want to do is reference a property on the debugger, not the debugger here. You know what? This is a bad, we'll just call it user, right? We want to reference a, you know what? Not even user. Let's be even more specific. Programmer. We want to reference a property on the programmer to see if debugging is enabled for them. So, if, and we're going to do this 2 ways. I'll show you both. The second one is the correct one. This is the working but not the best one. If programmer.debug enabled, then do that, right? So let's program that, and then let's call our critical. Property not found. We'll call that property. Debugging enabled. Whoops. So we're calling our critical, and nothing's happening. We see that the verb executed, and we see that it took 86 ticks, but we didn't see anything. Why is that? Well, is debugging enabled? At debug. Toggle to off, so it was on. Now we turn it back on again. We call it. We're still not seeing anything. And the reason for that is that we set a property on the generic programmer for debugging enabled, and we defaulted it to false, 0. So when we show ourselves debugging enabled, set to 0. If we want to see debugging, we'll have to say number 2, debugging enabled to 1. Now, if we execute our code, we should see our debug information. So now, by setting a property on themselves, any programmer on our whole MOO could enable and disable whether they see debugging information. But, like I said, this isn't the best way to do this. Now, the code is fine, but in terms of readability, we're starting to get what's called spaghetti code, or, just code that looks very pyramid-y. We don't want that. So instead of saying, if this is true, do this thing, let's say, if it's false, continue. Now, what continue will do is, if you're familiar with many programming languages, a lot of them have these continue blocks, similar to breaks, right? A lot of you will know like switch statements. Now, MOO does not have a switch statement. But say you had a switch statement, and you'd have a case 1, and then inside it you'd have a break. It's cool that it actually knows that I want what to do with a case, even though there are no cases in MOO. You'd have a break, MOO can do breaks as well, so you could have a break inside a for loop. A continue is going to make the loop just jump to the next programmer. Whatever's next in this iteration, it will stop execution of this current scope and just go to the next one up here. So we're saying if the debugging is not enabled, just continue. If it is enabled, meaning this was debugging enabled was set to 1, this will execute, and we will see what we need to see. So as you are about to see, this will work exactly the same. And we see our information. So now what we've done is made it so that a single, individual person can enable or disable debugging. We've seen how a property on a parent can be overwritten on a child. And we've seen how the use of a global property to enable or disable debugging as a whole can be used to save ticks in the long haul. It's always good to forward think, because your game will hopefully grow to have many users and many GMs and admin and all these people that are in there doing things all the time, and many scheduled and forked tasks that are going to be running at all times of the day. So saving ticks is going to make your game faster and more efficient. And keeping in mind whether a property is clear or not, and not overwriting properties on children that don't need to be overwritten, will keep your database size smaller. I think that's about it for this video. In the next one, we will expand a little bit more on this and talk about take a little bit deeper dive into some of the packages or utilities packages that the MOO offers. Thanks for watching.